Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. We're just going to give everyone a little bit of time to join us. And apologies for our 3-minute late start. Still waiting for more people to join us. So just going to allow people to trickle in. Welcome everyone. Welcome everybody. And it's great, wonderful to have everyone here, joining from across the Caribbean, and I suspect because of our lineup across the world. So welcome everyone. I'm just gonna give everyone about a minute, maybe half a minute more to join. And if you know anyone who wanted to be here but couldn't be here, or you want to listen back again to some of the remarks, we will be making this recording available on our SRC website. So have no fear, our YouTube channel. Welcome everybody. So I'm gonna get started, and I do believe we have two of our panelists who may be joining us a little bit late, but we're gonna get started. So good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar entitled A CARICOM Sustainable and Inclusive Trade Agenda. My name is Genevieve Remy, and I am fortunate to be the director of the Sridath Rampal Center for International Trade Law, Policy and Services. We call ourselves the SRC. And I'm delighted to host today's discussion on such a critical topic for our region. In recent years, we've seen a growing global movement towards reshaping trade to be more inclusive and sustainable, ensuring that its benefits reach all people, particularly in vulnerable and marginalized communities. I believe some of the assumptions about trade lifting all boats have been critically examined and re-examined in light of growing disparities between haves and have-nots, groups that are protected and advanced and advantaged, and those that are being sort of left behind. So the conversation about inclusive and sustainable trade is very critical, especially for our own region in the Caribbean, where although we do have elements of trade policies, we still lack a very discernible trade policy that unites Caribbean states, much less a sustainable and inclusive one. As you will hopefully hear today, the region does have a unique opportunity to play a meaningful and even leadership role in this transformation to more sustainable and inclusive societies. And I'm so happy that today's conversation will begin exploring that topic on how we can forge a trade agenda that empowers our citizens, our leaders, our businesses, our marginalized communities, and ensures that no one is left behind. I am so fortunate to have a global, extraordinary panel of speakers with us today, each of whom brings a wealth of experience, expertise, and passion for advancing this agenda. Minister Kerry Simmons is the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade of Barbados, has distinguished himself in WTO circles and is a staunch advocate for sustainable trade, being a member of the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate and working globally, but also in his own ministry to align trade policy with climate action, but also the broader sustainability agenda. And we're really looking forward to hearing what Barbados is doing as part of the Caribbean and what his thoughts are in beginning a more inclusive trade policy making agenda. Ambassador Nadia Theodore is Canada's representative to the World Trade Organization, and not a stranger to this region. Her background is very much allied to the region. Her parents are from St. Lucia. And she has also been a friend to us, my students, when we visit the WTO by hosting many of our students. But in this capacity, she is leading, one of the leading voices at the WTO in promoting equitable trade policies, practices, and negotiating stances. Her deep involvement at the WTO gives her a unique perspective on global trade and Canada's involvement in advancing that sustainable and inclusive agenda. Really happy to have you here, Ambassador. We are also honored to have Professor Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Seger, head of the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, where I'm a fellow, and also a fellow at Cambridge University. Professor Cordonnier-Seger is a globally recognized expert in sustainable development law, and she will share some key trends and innovative initiatives that are helping to shape a more inclusive global trade landscape. Welcome. Dr. Marcus Gehring is Director of Studies at Cambridge University and Senior Fellow at that Center for International Sustainable Development Law, and he will conclude our panel discussions. His extensive work in international and European trade law, particularly around environmental sustainability and human rights, provides a great basis for us to see how trade agreements can be structured to advance inclusivity for small states like ours. Last but not least, let me just briefly introduce my co-author of the SRC policy brief, who I'm beginning to think of as one of our burgeoning trade consultants. She's recently graduated with first-class honors from Cambridge University, having done her first degree at the University of the West Indies, and she works in government in Jamaica. So together with Peter Gay, we will present our latest work at the Sridhar Ramphal Center, where she did an internship over the summer, culminating in our policy brief focusing on how Caribbean can leverage global momentum to build this inclusive and sustainable trade agenda. And we're using this session just to put the final touches on that work. So please, I hope you all come in with questions and comments on what we're going to present. And we will be learning from our fellow experts as they impart some of what they have been doing in their respective spheres in this really important area of sustainable and inclusive trade. So how we will proceed with today's brief webinar is we will start with some opening remarks from our minister to set the tone. Peter Gay and I will then present very briefly some main components of that SRC policy brief that will come out. And then I will ask Ambassador Theodore, followed by Professor Cordonnier-Seger, followed by Dr. Gehring, to give their own perspectives that will help really enrich the discussion. And then we will save enough time to entertain comments and questions from this audience, and then we will conclude. So without any further ado, let me turn to Minister Simmons to deliver some opening remarks and to set the tone for today's webinar. Minister Simmons, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Janive. And let me begin by inviting you, first of all, to signal to me when you think I've said enough. And secondly, to thank you for this opportunity to participate. I think what you're doing is a wonderful and good thing. Perhaps I should begin by saying that it has become very obvious to me as I looked at this auspicious panel arrayed before me, that I have the singular purpose of speaking as a policymaker. And that perhaps gives me a unique perspective in this regard, because it perhaps gives me the opportunity to begin on the tone of what is the policymaker's ambition when we speak to the issue of sustainability and inclusivity in trade. Now, obviously, for us who are charged with responsibility, we've got to have a flight path of sorts, which is going to speak to the goals and the objectives and the targets that you want to meet, and you're speaking on behalf of an entire economy. I begin by accepting that there is tremendous merit in inclusivity and sustainability as an ambition. Tremendous merit. And you may say to me, well, Senior Minister, condescend to specifics. Why? What are the particulars? And I think that in a nutshell, what we're striving at is having a set of circumstances economically where we have opportunities. First and foremost, let me emphasize, increasing opportunities for people in the society to be able to share more widely in the benefits of commerce, domestic and foreign, and also minimizing at the same time the fallout or the potential fallout and harm to your environment, and maximizing long-term opportunities again for sustainability. Now, there are some principles that I think we should address. And the first one would be the economic prosperity issue. And that is almost a given when you speak of trade, because the reason why we trade is because we are trying to see that the private sector entities, and in some cases public, are making money. Whether domestic or external trade, you're looking for a holistic approach to economic growth. You're looking for a holistic approach that will impact a wide swath or cross-section of your society, and do so in a very positive way. So I begin there. There are some other priorities, however. The second one would be, in my view, that you want to ensure that that quest for economic prosperity is inextricably linked to social equity. And for us in the Caribbean region, we understand that because we've come through that experience of social inequality in a very major way. So we're looking at things like poverty reduction, which is still a major theme across all of the Caribbean societies. Equally cross-cutting theme would be the question of less social and economic inequality and access to opportunities within our societies, and equally a more stable economy. I think equally that the question of inclusivity and sustainability must also speak to environmental protection. And I would place some emphasis on sustainability in the context of positively confronting and combating the climate crisis. For those of us who are small island developing states, we sit, as you know, on the cusp of the climate crisis. And in many ways, we have to shape policies in a new way now so that we prevent the abuse or misuse, or in some cases, the overuse of existing resources. And if I had to give you a very practical example, and one that Barbados readily participated in, it would be in the IUU, the illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing exercise, which the WTO has tried to build a coalition around. And we were one of the first and leading voices to get involved there. And again, because of the fact that there's tremendous opportunity in our fisheries resource, but we will squander that if we ourselves abuse and misuse it and not manage effectively. And equally, we have to prevent those who have greater capacity coming into our waters and doing tremendous damage, which we are too small to really confront and compete with singularly. I think that in the interest of time, I would say that much of that which we are trying to do and will be doing is linked or indexed to the question of global responsibility. And I know it is very often not a popular thing to hear from I shouldn't say popular, it is not a frequent thing to hear from a person who is in politics, but there is such a thing as moral obligation. And the global public goods are potentially impacted in a very negative way if we do not treat this issue of sustainability and inclusivity in an appropriate manner. There's a common heritage of mankind: our oceans, our climate, public health, access to food, access to clean drinking water. Those are some of the fundamentals that are common to all of us as human beings, wherever we are. And there has to be an element of social justice built into these things, and the need for us to be able to better access opportunities for those things and to preserve those aspects of our common heritage, especially with respect to environmental protection issues and so on. So those are linked, I think, inextricably to the economic development issue, which I began on. And that is where I think the policymaker must now, if I could speak on behalf of all policymakers, where the policymaker ought to be standing as he contemplates, shaping a way forward.
Excellent, Minister. Thank you so much for these insightful remarks to open up the discussion. I'm very happy that some of the buzzwords you mentioned actually are featured in our policy brief. So Peter Gay, tick, tick, tick. And we're hoping that the policymakers are very much part and parcel of what we consider to be the beginnings of building blocks of a more regional approach to the sustainable and inclusive agenda. So very interesting to hear what Barbados's priorities are, but even more interesting, to see how that joins up to a regional approach being led at CARICOM and in the sub-region at the OECS. So I think it's a great, thank you so much again. I think it's a great segue to our presentation. Peter Gay and I met actually as a result of LinkedIn. She reached out. She was concluding her master's at Cambridge, where I also studied, and was interested in knowing if I had any interest in bringing on an intern. And the rest was history. So she spent some time with us at the center, and we actually met in Cambridge with Marie-Claire and Marcus at the Lauterpack Center, where, again, it was a bit of a homecoming. And they're doing amazing work, amazing amount of teaching and study in academia, but also bringing it really literally to the masses, democratizing the sustainability agenda. So really proud to be associated with that. And so it's a little bit daunting for us to put something out about the Caribbean, but we still see this as a learning experience, and we couldn't be in better company. So without further ado, Peter Gay, who I think we've lost, I don't know where she's gone to, but Peter Gay and I will be doing a presentation now that is sort of very much the bare bones of what we have written in our policy brief. And that should come out within the next 2 weeks or so. And the idea is to just entice you enough to read it and give you a sense of where we think the agenda for CARICOM policy, where it should be situated, how it should be advanced. So Peter Gay was supposed to start off the presentation. I guess her internet access isn't what it should be. So I'm going to start, and as soon as she joins, I will hand over to her. So theoretically, we know that trade and trade policy, not anything good or negative inherently can be attributed to trade. In fact, on that side of the ledger, despite recent pronouncements and the public perception that trade is bad for the environment and trade leaves many people behind, in fact, the theory of trade is that it lifts all boats, and everyone should be better situated as a result of increased liberalized trade, and that's why we have the WTO. And we know that between 95, for instance, and 2023, because of a lot of very recent work, including by the WTO Secretariat, as well as other agencies, that the global GDP has risen as a result of trade. And even the most vulnerable and the lowest middle income countries, their trade has also increased. There's an idea that in terms of the environmental agenda, there's an opportunity with sustainability for a boost in the buying and selling of environmental goods and services, geographical indicators, advancement and opportunities of the blue, green, and other rainbow economies. But on the other side of the ledger, we know there is going to be, and there has been, accompanying these increasing trade volumes, more transportation, therefore more greenhouse gas emissions. And especially in COVID, and as a result of more unilateral measures, we see these accompanied also by more protectionist import restrictions, which endanger economic resilience of the world and the global commerce at large, and an increase in endangered species trade, loss in biodiversity, and unregulated fishing, as the minister just mentioned. Now, the WTO, funny enough, released its Trade and Inclusiveness report in 2024 after we had done a lot of our work. But no surprises, I think, there in terms of the overall findings. I think we all expected what we saw. Yay, Peter Gay, this was not my slide. So please, you can continue. We're on the second slide. Go ahead. You can unmute your mic.
Hi, good day,
Go ahead.
everyone.
Yes.
I apologize for the technical difficulties, but just let me take this time to thank the presenters and those joining us as part of this lunchtime chat. And we hope to learn from and improve our paper through your valuable contributions and interventions. So I know that Dr. Remy, it seems as if you started already, but the paper really starts off by recognizing trade's transformative role in reducing poverty. And between 1995 and 2023, the global per capita income increased by approximately 65%. And the per capita income of low and middle income economies have also tripled over the past three decades. And this is largely attributable to international trade. But notwithstanding these tremendous gains, trade has not produced equal benefits both within and across countries. There's still a significant portion of the global population that remains marginalized in the international trade system. So around 13% of people, especially in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, are on the fringes of the international trade system. And these economies like the regions like the Caribbean continue to see a high percentage of divergent economies where growth staggers or is lagging behind. And these points that I've mentioned and what we've also highlighted in the paper are also the subject of the WTO's most recent report titled Trade Inclusiveness, How to Make Trade Work for All. And what I'll take this time to do is maybe identify some of the nuances that came out of the trade report. So the trade report highlighted that there are growing opportunities in trade in services. So the trade in services has grown 6.8% annually since 1990. And in particular, digitally delivered services has also grown at about 8.2% since 2005. And there's also been an increase in renewable energy goods trade. And this has grown the fastest of all by about 10.3% a year. So the report highlighted that these are some opportunities for the Caribbean as well. There's also an indication that there's rising protectionism and economic nationalism, and that there's restrictive trade blocks, and this has the potential to harm the growth prospects of all economies, particularly developing economies like the Caribbean. The report, one key takeaway from the report is that while trade is instrumental to economic growth and can in some way reduce inequalities, rules for open trade and simplified trade are not enough. They have to be complemented by other policies at the domestic and the international level to make sure that trade benefits all persons and is indeed inclusive. So policies like education, labor, and taxation are more effective, according to the report, than trade policy at addressing structural inequalities. So I'll take a little time now to look at the situational analysis of the Caribbean. And in this trade report that I mentioned earlier, it suggests that around 40% of Caribbean countries are diverging economies, which means that a lot of Caribbean economies or countries are not keeping up or struggling to keep up with the global economy. And they face issues like slow development, weak institutions and industries, high levels of debt and inadequate debt management. And actually, even though it's not referenced here in the slide, the Inter-American Development Bank also released this year that the Latin American and Caribbean region is the world's most unequal region, where 10% of the highest earners make on average about 12 times more than the poorest 10% of the population. the region also has the highest cost for a healthy diet, which has implications for nutritional insecurity. Now, when we approached the paper, we also looked at some global indicators or some global metrics to get an idea or to kind of tell us a story about how the Caribbean region is doing from a sustainable and inclusive standpoint. So the Human Development Index report indicates that while all Caribbean countries or all CARICOM countries are classified within the very high, and medium categories in terms of ranking, there are significant variations across the region. So on this slide here, you see that St. Kitts and Nevis, Antigua and Barbuda, and Bahamas are ranked quite highly, but then you have other countries like Belize, Suriname, and Haiti that are ranked quite poorly. Even St. Lucia, that is not referenced here, is ranked at about 108 out of 193 countries. For the Sustainable Development Goals ranking, the report that was produced this year, it also shows that CARICOM countries are generally ranking quite poorly in terms of their accomplishments of certain sustainable development goals. And when we looked on the metrics and the reports of a number of Caribbean countries, it showed that Caribbean countries face stagnation in multiple SDGs, but particularly in SDGs related to poverty alleviation, education, and environmental sustainability. Now, we also looked at the ease of business doing ranking, and even though the World Bank has discontinued producing more reports in relation to this particular indicator, we still decided to look on it because it shows that the Caribbean still has, that there are significant issues in terms of opening businesses, in terms of getting credit for private institutions, and basically it shows that the Caribbean really has more to go in terms of facilitating MSMEs and also larger companies. We also looked at the Trade Logistics Index, and this index really indicates the quality of trade and transport related infrastructure. And as you can see on the slide, again, the Caribbean has some way to go. And this also is, I think, also an indication of why the Caribbean region isn't doing as well as it should in terms of trade. So even though Antigua and Barbuda and Bahamas, the ranking is, it's relatively okay. The table here, and it's just a selective table, it's showing that quite a bit of Caribbean countries, there's still difficulties in terms of the quality of trade and transport related infrastructure. We were only able to get data for only 3 CARICOM countries, but what it shows is that Barbados and Jamaica, from a CARICOM standpoint, are leading in terms of global innovation. But then Trinidad and Tobago, even though it has significant energy reserves and also is doing very well intra-regionally, they're still lagging behind in terms of global innovation. The paper also highlights the evolution of sustainability and inclusivity from its intervention in international law. And the scholars have shown that from inception, the concept was focused on conservation and rational use of non-renewable resources. So its historical roots can be found in the European forestry practices, particularly in the 18th century. And we highlighted several milestones which indicates just the evolution of the principle. So it really started off as responding to certain concerns with environmental sustainability. And the term sustainable development is often associated with the Brundtland Commission's 1987 report, which defines sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And we noted in the paper that the Brundtland definition from its outset introduced certain elements of inclusivity by highlighting the importance of intertemporal considerations and protecting the environment in a prospective way. The paper also highlights the evolution of inclusivity in global governance So the evolution of inclusivity in international law is largely connected to the human rights advancement after the World War II, particularly with the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and also the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. From our research, we highlighted or identified that inclusive development, even though it was featured in academic literature from as early as 1998, it did not attain central focus until about 2008. And academic literature often uses different terms. So it will use inclusive growth, inclusive development, inclusivity. And we will use these terms interchangeably throughout the presentation and throughout the white paper. But inclusivity is largely focused on the most marginalized in society. It is focused on sectors and areas of exclusion and providing equal opportunities for participation. Inclusiveness also introduces elements of redistributing social benefits and providing targeting capacity building alongside opportunities. So for us, we decided to pair inclusivity and sustainability as while both have similar foundations, we believe that both introduce important elements and important considerations. So sustainable development for us presents the overarching framework, and it's grounded in three pillars of sustainability, which is the economic, environmental, and social pillars. And so it provides the sort of substantive elements to the framework, but inclusivity, as I mentioned earlier, introduces certain essential governance and procedural considerations. So as I mentioned earlier, inclusivity, particularly for the purposes of trade, is aimed at ensuring that all sectors of society, particularly the marginalized and basically non-traditional stakeholders in the trade discussions, not only benefit from trade, but also participate in the development and implementation of trade policy.
So we don't have that much time, Peter, so we need to like maybe go quicker.
Okay, all right. So what I will move to is possibly even moving to some of the recent trends that we have identified in a number of regional trade agreements and free trade agreements. So we noticed that, first of all, that the concept of sustainability and inclusivity, initially it started off as being mainly referenced in the preambular paragraphs of trade agreements, but it has now evolved into becoming part of the main text and even in chapters dedicated to important topics like the environment, labor. One other thing that we recognized was the fact that sustainability provisions that initially they were not subject to dispute settlement mechanisms, and still a large number of free trade agreements and regional trade agreements do not subject these sustainability and inclusivity provisions to the dispute settlement mechanism. But we are seeing that there is a growing diversity in relation to the enforceability mechanisms. So it ranges, for example, from state to state disputes. And we see that, for example, in a number of EU agreements and also in the CPTPP. There's also use of dedicated expert panels and also increasing civil society monitoring. Another important observation that we made in terms of trends is a growing participation of non-traditional stakeholders. So there's greater involvement of civil society and non-state actors, both in the monitoring and enforceability of sustainability provisions. And one sort of, I guess, takeaway or critique that we identified was that notwithstanding the greater inclusion of sustainability and inclusivity provisions, more research needs to be done on the effectiveness of including these provisions in trade agreements and them actually producing real life results. So one recommendation and something that we also highlight in the paper is that in order to ensure that there is genuine non-traditional stakeholder intervention and contribution to the trade policy process, there has to be, first, these civil society groups have to be more densely represented, and there also has to be adequate funding of civil society groups at all levels in the trade policy process.
Peter, give maybe 1 minute to round it up because we have to get to the Caribbean approach.
Okay, right. So one other thing that we recognized and what we studied was just the approaches by different countries and regions. I'll just highlight a few quickly. So for example, I mentioned earlier that the EU is I would consider them to be one of the global leaders in terms of integrating sustainability provisions, and they are well known for their trade and sustainability chapters. And the CARICOM EU, EPA, signaled a shift and was one of those first new trade agreements that included certain enforceable commitments with a monitoring provision. In terms of countries, for example, New Zealand has emerged as a global leader by distinguishing itself through complementary policies that enhance its trade strategy, particularly its landmark Trade for All agenda and its productive, sustainable, and inclusive trade channels and framework. The United States also is considered a global leader, and recently its International Trade Commission has been conducting a number of investigations and research on the possible or potential distributional effects of trade and goods and services trade and its impact on certain workers like Black workers, older workers, and those with varying levels of education. Highlighted on this slide is also just organizational approaches that are increasingly advancing the sustainable and inclusive agenda, like UNCTAD, the International Trade Center, and the OECD.
Okay. Peter, again, that was excellent. I hate to cut you off, but you actually took up the entire 50 minutes.
I'm so sorry about that.
No, because I think it just shows you how much work, as I'm hearing you speak, how much work was done and just trying to set the scene. And as you'll see from our policy brief, there's a part 1 which explains kind of where we are. And again, the experts here can say much more, but how we then now move to part 2 of the paper, which is then what does CARICOM do about this agenda that is writ large, being pursued by all of these other regions, countries, organizations, and how does the Caribbean discern what elements are useful to it, understanding that there are certain even conflicts in achieving one part of that sustainability agenda against another. We could think very concretely, for instance, about discovery of oil in Guyana and the obvious benefits economically to pursuing a strategy for low costs in oil and manufacturing capacity that will grow. And that directly conflicts with the environmental aspect of sustainability. And then thinking about the justice dimension when it comes to sustainability, well, we are the least heavy emitters of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere historically and presently. So where is the justice if Caribbean countries, for instance, cannot make use of some of these fossil fuels for their own economic advancement? So in part of the paper, you realize that it's not always linear. Advancing the economic doesn't always work hand in hand in advancing the economic. And where does the Caribbean situate itself? So I am actually going to go very quickly and entice you to read the paper just to show you kind of where our thinking has landed based on that brilliant overview that Peter Gay has given us. So in the Caribbean, the trade policy emanates, as we all know, from plantation economies, dependence on single crops, and now even dependence on very high services, dependence on tourism, which itself during COVID has emerged as a problem, both in terms of sustainability, environmentally, but also economically. And we also have very small intra-regional trade, undiversified trade, clear market leaders in Trinidad and increasingly now Guyana leading some of the thinking even on the sustainability agenda because of its largesse in bringing the region along as a result of its oil discoveries. But reading from economists in the region, it paints a very bleak picture about our trade complementarity and our trade prospects. We have very outdated technologies, high energy costs, very outdated port infrastructure, basic even connection infrastructure in certain countries, and an over-reliance on certain sectors, limited export diversification, and very real, concretely, huge vulnerability to environmental and economic shocks plaguing the world economy. Extra-regionally, so that is our trade outside the region has actually shrunk in terms of its global exports from 0.6% in the 80s to 0.1% in 2019. Very traditional partners running a trade deficit with all of them, which may not be unexpected, but it would be good to see some of the areas where we have some potential, but the prospects look a little bit daunting. We have limited formal trade agreements. The EPA Peter Gay mentioned, we were actually on the vanguard of that sustainability chapters, the EPA being the first with that kind of sustainability focus, but we now lag behind. We have some partial scope agreements in Latin America. We have some preferential access into the US market, but we actually have no formal trade agreements with some of our major developing country markets, although there are a lot of overtones politically of making more of our trade relations with Africa, Brazil, Latin America, China, and very few inclusive and sustainability provisions. And what we try to do is look at all of the major trade agreements that CARICOM is signatory to, both intra-regionally as well as the one fully fledged trade agreement with the EPA, to just mark out for you where we sit in terms of some of the topics that Peter Gay mentioned are defining that sustainability and inclusive agenda, both substantively, but also, as you will see, process related. So are stakeholders invited to contribute? Is there a mechanism for conducting ex ante and ex post reviews of how the trade agreement is doing writ large and advancing the economy, but also its impacts on individual groups, like what New Zealand does very well, and Canada, I know, does very well in terms of monitoring progress. So where are the opportunities? So we're talking very, very sort of doom and gloom, but there's also huge opportunities for the region. Let's not talk about finance, but when we think about trade and trade opportunities, in theory, our region could really grow into a rainbow, I call it, economy. In the green economy, if we focused on certain niche markets, but also infrastructure and technology and energy, the blue economy, big island, big ocean states, the orange economy, creativity in the region, if we could just harness that potential and make use of digital opportunities to really leapfrog MSMEs, women-led, youth-led economic sectors. We did a very brief overview of which islands in the Caribbean individually are pursuing elements of an S&I, sustainable and inclusive agenda. They may not call it that, but they are doing certain things that actually speak to that agenda. So Trinidad's trade policy and its just transition to reskill workers, again, a focus on individuals and workers that might be left behind if we go low carbon. And that's something also that is really important, is the just transition of workers in these sectors that are heavily oil dependent. Barbados recently, its mission-oriented strategy, unfortunately, I was looking for trade in that strategy, Minister, and that's something we should talk about. Trade and the trade regime wasn't leveraging it, but it is a strategy for Barbados to use its resources and its economic, and it's also all of its resources to grow a strategy that is based on a resilient and sustainable approach. Jamaica also focuses on sustainability, has sustainability in some of its trade policy language. Antigua and Barbuda likewise. Belize, Guyana has this ambitious, although in order to avoid the Dutch disease, this green state development strategy, although obviously it has discovered oil. And we want to mention some of the work the region's civil society is doing. This is never, ever highlighted in these kinds of fora, but Canary has released the Caribbean Climate Justice and Resilience Agenda that also has elements. They may not call it trade, but it does have elements of this S&I agenda we're talking about. Now, I'll spend the least amount of time on this slide, and it actually occupies maybe the biggest portion of our paper, which is where are the building blocks that we see when we draw internationally from where we can develop a CARICOM position. We kind of come up with 4 main building blocks for developing that agenda. One, fundamentally and beyond trade, again, putting all of these big ideas into a trade basket, because that's our competence. That's what we do at the Street Arts Ramphal Center. But it has to be part of a common approach to development priorities in the region. Trade is an emanation. It's a means. We have to think about what is in the developmental interest of the region, and then trade becomes easier and to pursue. We also think it makes sense to capitalize on the current agreements and current processes that we are already involved in. Where are the intersections between maritime, between IMO, WTO, UNFCCC? and update our existing relationships that are many times built in the past. We also think there should be a focus on revitalizing, from a trade perspective, the key sectors: energy, climate, maritime, sorry, that should be maritime and tourism, blue economy, food security, cross-cutting sectoral policies, so innovation, digitization, finance. That undergirds any of this discussion. How do we think about this in trade terms? We put some ideas forward of the opportunities that trade agreements allow us to pursue. And then we also think we need to look in-house. We need to see where are the obligations in our current trade arrangements under CARICOM that we need to leverage, that we need to build out, that we're currently not building out, and we're not doing enough in terms of creating a trade policy mechanism and process that the region can benefit from, and bringing in academia, research partner institution, national processes, and ultimately civil society. So we come up with maybe about 6 or 7 recommendations. They stem from the substantive, which is really tasked the Secretariat, in particular the CARICOM Single Market and Economy Unit, supported by institutions, with conducting an inventory and assessment of existing provisions. A lot of it we've done already in this paper, and then building in some ex post ex ante assessments of impacts on groups of current trade policies, and building a mechanism for the continuous update of that work, like New Zealand, Canada, and that will need a machinery, and it will need funding. We also think that CARICOM bodies, I'm a big fan of breaking down the silos, needs to begin looking at where the international SI agenda intersects with what they're doing regionally, and then review where we need to do more at a regional level in bringing some of these sectors, giving them greater power, invigorating them, and then at a process-related level, charge our Council on Trade and Economic Development with a watching brief over all the multilateral, international, and regional negotiations and processes that bear on the sustainability and inclusive agenda, get the CARICOM working groups and organs with the trade and these intersecting ministries, finance, climate, transport, women, innovation, to meet technically on a regular basis to coordinate approaches, learn from each other, and where necessary, ratchet that up to the heads of government for action, engage the donors that provide the funding for the sustainability agenda, millions of dollars being expended in individual countries, to build on our own priorities and make sure there's complementarity across the region, and establish focal points for regular engagement using Article 26 of the CARICOM Treaty, where we are supposed to have consultations to engage a broader cross-section of interests, and then invest in ongoing technical research and training of negotiators and trade officials on all this massive agenda. So we have some ideas. I'm so sorry it took more than 20, 30 minutes. We intended it to be 15. But luckily, we have great speakers, and we wanted to give you a good basis on which to have a discussion. So thank you all for your attention. I'm going to now stop the PowerPoint. We do have about 40 minutes, and I've asked each of our speakers to speak for 10 minutes, which will give us some time for Q&A. So sorry for taking so long, but that's our approach in our paper. Ambassador Theodore, thank you, Peter Gay. Ambassador Theodore, over to you. I'm sorry for infringing on your time.
Thanks, Jenny. It's really a pleasure to be here. I mean, in part because of the current hat that I wear here in Geneva as Canada's ambassador and permanent representative to the World Trade Organization, and to UNCTAD, and to WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Office, and to the International Trade Center. But also, I mean, as you kind of mentioned off the top, my deep passion for all things inclusive growth, inclusive trade, sustainable trade, and in particular, as it relates to the Caribbean region and to the African continent, and what Canada can do to really support a truly global economic governance structure that does indeed rise all boats. You know this, Jenny, but those on the line might not know that my passion isn't just about, frankly, words. In fact, I wrote my master's research paper a very, very long time ago on the World Trade Organization and what full participation in that trading system could look like for Caribbean island economies. And so it was a topic at the time that really, for me, was about using
Is it just me or we're not hearing? Ambassador, we're not hearing you. Uh-oh.
I think
We're
we've
not
lost
hearing. We're not hearing you. We've lost your sound. Oh no. Can you? I think you're in and out. Oh no. Okay, I'm gonna try to salvage Ambassador. Oh, here she's back. Yes, Ambassador, please. Yes. Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
I guess everybody's connection that's odd. Everybody's connection is having an issue.
Yes.
I just thought what I was saying is that, you know, my passion is really grounded in that intersection of my academic, my professional, and my personal background. Yes, I am back, Marilyn, indeed. um, so listen, what I thought I would do, and I do apologize that I'll have to talk and dash, but what I thought I would do is kind of give you a little bit of an overview of what we do in Canada and what our approach to this concept of inclusive trade has been, and I'll say that uh, you know uh, what the honorable minister said and the framework that he laid out in his opening remarks, I could really just say +1, because it really is a very similar trajectory and a very similar framing that Canada is really trying to pursue in our own journey with regards to inclusive trade. Um, and I say this because, you know, it's been a long time that Canada really understood that a positive consensus around trade, both globally but also domestically, can't be taken for granted, frankly. You know, in Canada, we've worked on ways to ensure that our communities, our citizens, continue to know, but most importantly, to feel the benefits of trade, and have done that both through a domestic lens and also through an international global lens. So when I look at the domestic approach, you know, I could really look at it by framing it in 3 ways. First, acknowledging the challenge that we have. We are a country where local businesses are classified, and people might not realize this when they think about Canada, but local businesses are classified as micro businesses or small businesses, make up 98% of employers in the country. And they employ about 60% of our workforce. So our economy and the way that people feel about their livelihoods in Canada is inextricably linked to small and micro businesses. And so that statistic alone kind of drove home this idea that whatever our approach to trade policy and business development is going to be, we needed to make sure that it was done in a way that was going to benefit this large segment of businesses, small businesses and micro-sized businesses, and the people that are employed by them. And so it was kind of against that backdrop that we developed this inclusive approach to trade that was, again, articulated by acknowledging the challenge. So being very well aware and not shying away from that criticism of international trade and globalization, that has kind of led to a retreat from the international rules-based order, and a system that we know that has provided an unparalleled amount of prosperity to Canada and to others. And then engaging, I mean, and the minister and yourself, Jenny, said it as well, you know, engaging with more than the usual suspects to really dig in and better understand the criticism, because it's quite easy, even as policymakers. I mean, I'm not a politician, but certainly as a politician, I'm sure. But as a policymaker and policy advisor, it's quite easy to dig in to the rhetoric around the criticism and leave out the specifics and not really dig into the specifics. And so we undertook a very extensive approach that is around digging into what people actually fear and the criticism around trade and globalization. And I'll highlight a couple of the things that I've heard and that we have heard, because I do think that it could be instructive for CARICOM countries if they want to pursue the same type of engagement. So things that we've heard: perceived lack of transparency in trade agreement negotiations, the perception that it's only large corporations that are benefiting, and that large corporations, of which there are not many in Canada, as I said at the outset, have special rights and special privileges that are accorded to them by virtue of these trade agreements. A perception that trade agreements have very negative consequences to certain segments of the population, in particular the middle class. So this idea that trade and trade negotiations and trade agreements hollow out the middle class. And then, as you rightly said, Jenny, this idea that trade agreements are a threat to the environment, to health and safety regulations, to consumer standards, as opposed to a value add. And then the next thing, which is kind of the important piece, and where it moves into the international aspect of what I do, is this idea of taking action. So what we have committed to in Canada is really about taking action on what we've heard. So we now put more Canadians at the heart of our agenda. So this is obviously not just about more open consultations, which is kind of the obvious one, but it's also making the linkages between trade and investment and that agenda and domestic socioeconomic policies, and trying to be more vocal and relatable with regards to why trade matters, who it helps, how it can help, what are the different types of businesses and the different types of opportunities that are available to businesses for them to tap into. And you know, rightly mentioned perhaps a dilemma that Guyana is facing, and that's a perfect example of how, you know, governments, if they are doing it right, really don't shy away from these hard conversations between trade and investment and a domestic socioeconomic policy or leaning, but really be vocal about what the opportunities can be, and where the potential ideas for partnerships and innovation can be, so that it's a win-win. The second category of action that we've taken is really about recognizing that trade doesn't become a race to the bottom. And you spoke a little bit about this, Jenny, in your presentation as well. And Canada has really doubled down on this idea that businesses should not be penalized. And in fact, they should be incentivized to conduct business in a manner that is aligned with broader socioeconomic goals. And as the minister, I can't remember how the minister put it, I wrote it down actually because I thought it was so good. The minister said that there's a common heritage to mankind when you think about these things. And, you know, we couldn't agree more. So in practice, that looks like strengthened labor and environmental protections, innovative provisions that allow Canada an ability to regulate to achieve these bigger public policy goals around public health and social services. And we really double down on that, and we've done so unapologetically, because we really do believe that that is part of the inclusive trade and inclusive growth narrative and imperative, which then leads me to the international side. And frankly, what we have tried to do is take all of these things that we have done domestically, acknowledging the problem, not shying away from it, engaging with different, but not the usual suspects, and then doubling down on action. We've tried to do that globally as well. We have tried to take up space in that regard. We have tried to be the convener. We have tried to be the leader in building these conversations and building this collective action and this coalition with regards to inclusive trade and sustainable trade. And a few ways that I do it here at the WTO, I'll just finish on that, frankly, and maybe then yield the time to others. You know, as an ambassador and permanent representative here, my job traditionally, the role traditionally, has really been about, you know, negotiating the trade agreements that were being undertaken here in Geneva. And that still is a big part of the work, 100%. But what I can say that has changed kind of in the past decade-ish is really this idea that as an ambassador here in Geneva, part of my role is using the opportunity that we have to sit around the table with 162 other members or so to talk about some of the futuring of the trade system, some of the future issues that we believe to be fundamental to maintaining a positive narrative and a positive reality around the trading system. And we have done that. So, for example, in 2017, all of you will know about the Buenos Aires Ministerial Conference, where a group of members endorsed this joint declaration on trade and women's economic empowerment. And since then, here at the WTO, and Canada has been a leader on that, we have really taken that declaration forward into action, hosting workshops, hosting seminars, sharing information, but then also thinking about ways that we can put the spirit of the declaration into the work of the WTO. So one example is using trade policy reviews to raise issues around trade and gender, for example. And we, Canada, we've also worked with organizations that some of you might be familiar with, like the Center for Inclusive Trade and Development, to see how we can use the process of trade policy reviews as an example to really understand how trade and trade policy shows up differently in practice for women-owned and women-operated businesses, as opposed to other types of businesses, as an example. In 2018, we created the Inclusive Trade Action Group, which many of you will be familiar with, that led to the Global Trade and Gender Arrangement, another example of how we are taking a look at the traditional ways of doing trade and forming trade policy through a gender lens. Realizing that sometimes the provisions that we negotiate in practice show up differently for women-owned and women-led businesses and women-led exporters. And then, you know, I won't touch on fish because the minister did it much better than I ever could.
I hate to round the clock up, Ambassador. We have to round up, but I know you're almost done.
I am, yes.
I overshot my time, but sorry, go ahead. Just finish off your thought, of course, just letting you know.
I'll just stop here. Thanks.
No. Please conclude with what you were saying on
I'll stop here.
Oh, apologies. Oh dear. I'm so sorry. Just looking at the time for the other speakers, I know that you were almost done. So sorry to do that to you. I know so we actually have we overshot our time, Peter. So I'm so sorry to crunch everyone else. But if I can ask Professor Mary Claire, and then Marcus to give their interventions, 15 minutes, so that we can have at least one or two questions from the audience. That would be great. Apologies.
I'm actually going to be probably only 5 minutes, partly because I'm giving mainly an academic point of view here. And I was so fascinated by what Nadia was saying and what the minister was saying, and by your actual study, which to me is really the point of this seminar. And so I'll just add a few tiny thoughts which might be helpful in kind of that future thinking that Nadia was underlining just now. And it comes from an 11-year study that we did that was published in a book by Oxford University Press, which made me disappear when I held it out, called Athena's Treaties. And of course, in one sentence, the reason the book is called that and the way it's put together is that it is a bit odd. It turns out the god of trade for the Greeks was Mercury, or Hermes, the Greeks and Romans, who was the god of thieves. Imagine that. And so the book actually thinks through what would it be like if Athena, who was the goddess of justice and the crafts and maybe sustainable development, was also involved in our trade treaties. And it looks at it in particular by going through all the impact assessments that have been done over the last 20 or 30 years, where they brought up environmental or social or actually even economic impacts of some of the changes in trade rules that we've had. And we identified in the end actually just 3 normative tensions as well as a bunch of physical tensions. The first one was that there was a concern, and I'm a professor of trade and investment law and international law professor, and I hold the new chair in sustainable development law and policy here in the University of Cambridge, even though my research center at McGill is in Canada. And so maybe I'm looking at this with a little bit of demandingness from our trade policy. I really want to see us include that sustainability and that inclusion. But the first tension we identified going through all the impact assessments was that absent measures to preclude this, trade agreements could constrain the legitimate measures on sustainable development, including to implement other international treaty obligations that are held by states, which would be an issue for them. And of course, in your study, where you point to the way that the joined upness needs to happen in the process of the Caribbean's decision-making on trade, you're exactly underlining that point and the need for that policy coherence. Now, the second, tension, and there's only 3, is that trade measures in some of the treaties could actually constrain enforcement of domestic laws addressing the social and environmental problems. So these are laws that are in place that are meant to be able to address these problems, and they can't because of some of the interpretations of the trade rules. Now, speaking as a former government policymaker who was head of international affairs for the Natural Resources Ministry of Canada, I found this particularly interesting because I would have people coming into my office who didn't know I had a PhD in trade law from Oxford, who would say, "Oh, you can't do that. No, you can't. No, because we have a trade agreement and the trade agreement says you can't." And I'd be like, come here, little man, and we'll talk about that. But at the same time, it was a very real pressure. And of course, you could imagine another government official or someone, imagine from a municipality who wants to have green procurement for their purchase of the buses, for their city. They wouldn't have a degree in trade law from Oxford, and they would not feel the same willingness to, oh, let's talk about that a little bit. They'd just drop the measure, right? And so that was a real concern as well. And then the third one that came up was providing incentives for unsustainable trade and investment. And of course, you can see still some of that in some of the agreements we've got out there that are, for example, incentivizing, oil and gas, even though we've got a Paris Agreement saying we have to, transition away from fossil fuels. And so looking at those impact assessments, the real impact assessments done by countries over the years, we came up with some of the questions that we asked, and our answers had to come from the real trade treaties that countries have signed. And so as we go toward the future, I'll just, in the last 2 minutes, give a couple of examples of some of the answers we found to the questions. Now, the first one is that we were able to find a whole set of examples on that first tension of exceptions that have been written into the trade and investment treaties of different regions or countries to prevent economic rules from constraining the regulatory flexibility of the parties for social and environmental purposes in the field of sustainable development. And we found a whole set of different types of mechanisms that countries can adopt, and indeed they're doing more now than ever before in this area. The second is that we went through and we found across all of the different agreements, including the ones that Peter was presenting, quite a few examples of provisions that establish prescriptions or permissions for cooperation to resolve environmental and social problems that could be exacerbated by the bilateral regional economic treaties. So strengthening domestic laws and supporting efforts to be more inclusive through the trade agreements themselves. And those cooperation agendas travel with the trade, right? Which is actually very exciting. And then third, of course, and this is the bit that I actually find most fascinating, are the areas which Peter and Jeannie's actually highlighted, where you can see more than just cooperation, but actually liberalization of trade and promotion of investment in key areas that are deemed to be sustainable development areas that all our other treaties are begging us to invest in and begging us to increase our trade in. Things like renewables, things like cooperation on social policy. There are areas where we have a win-win-win, as it were, on the social, the environment, and the economic. Now, I'm not going to give too many exceptions due to time, too many examples due to time, but in terms of those types of exceptions, you can find everything from general exceptions, and you'll know them all if you read the GATT Article 20, but also non-application notes by parties for specific environmentally or socially sensitive sectors, or general interpretive statements to guide potential areas where trade investment rules would otherwise constrain the use of measures in others. In the second category, which is becoming more and more prevalent, and Peter, I agree with you that Europeans are really pushing this one out. But the Caribbean has asked for their own and gotten their own in this area as well. We've seen parallel agreements or cooperation chapters. We've seen the joint coordination of new institutions for social and environmental purposes alongside the trade agreements. We've seen common work programs on specific environmental or social projects, often accompanied by capacity building, technology transfer, or financing commitments, such as the ones that Nadia was talking about, or even, joint trade missions. We hosted Mary Ning here in Cambridge, and she brought an all-women CEO delegation with her. And I brought her into the Cambridge Union, and she explained what they were working on. And they were from some very small enterprises, many led, interestingly enough, by Caribbean women, but I'm sure that was complete coincidence. And they were in the UK, supported by the government of Canada, to make trade links. It's amazing to meet them, such amazing women. And then, of course, also we've seen some factual report or complaints mechanisms being set up to provide recourse when environmental or social rules appear to be violated in order to attract trade investment. And that type of recourse, as a law professor, of course, I'm strongly in favor of. So my last point will be that I think you have actually identified more than I would some of the most important ways to figure out which areas work for enhancing trade. And environmental services was one of the points from your report. There are others. And which areas especially can be impulsed and galvanized and encouraged through the process itself. And that's not just about setting up the right kind of structures to do sustainability impact assessments. That's not just about ensuring that intercoordination and interconnection between the different authorities that work on these issues, but it's also, of course, things like participation of civil society in trade and increasingly participation of civil society in the types of rules and the types of disputes that we're willing to try to solve in regard to investment. So I'm going to stop there, having sort of walked you through an 11-year study in about 5.5 minutes, and then I'm happy to answer any questions.
That was excellent. Very much appreciated. And I would highly recommend. It's something we consulted a lot. I know the Athena's treaties as your background text for understanding this vast area and the amazing work that Marie-Claire is doing together with Marcus, which is a great segue into the last presentation. And thank you for me not having to interrupt. I feel so bad that I'm interrupting, so excuse me.
I think actually you saved Nadia's life because she had another session that was starting at 5 here, and it's 5:17. So she was probably had a whole bunch of people waiting for her going, where is she?
Thank you so much. I feel terrible, but over to you, Dr. Gehring, and you can close us off. And if anyone has questions as we're going through the presentation, you can just park them in the Q&A, and we at least have them to look at whilst we're listening. Go ahead, over to you, Marcus.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers for having me. I'm all inspired by your paper because I think it asks and answers exactly the right questions, right? I think we need to overcome the sort of apparent conflict between wanting more trade and wanting to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals on the other hand. They go hand in hand, right? Without trade, we cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And that has been underlying our work. For the last 3 years, we've done a series of studies focusing on the trade relationship between the EU and Latin American countries. So your neighboring region, so to speak. And we found quite interesting examples how the relationship grows and how sustainable development as an objective to all these agreements could be made more tangible on both sides of the equation, right? So it's not a one-way street. It's not a conditionality of any kind. It's more, how can we collaborate in our joint efforts? So for example, we compared the NDCs and ask, are the current trade arrangements helping Latin American countries and helping the EU to fulfill their NDCs? What are the trade links in nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement? How can we create that policy space? And we came up with creative solutions. We came up with specific provisions which could be included. And the bottom line is only if we achieve the Paris Agreement objectives, only if we help each other to fulfill our NDCs under the Paris Agreement, can we all enjoy a sustainable future. So the new project that we're currently doing also looks at, if you're renewing your NDC, how should trade maybe feature in certain parts of your nationally determined contribution when reporting to the Paris Agreement and under the Paris Agreement, right? So how can we strengthen our effort? A recent study by the European Climate Foundation concluded that if we had zero trade, if we entered a new phase of protectionism globally, we would miss our net zero targets in all countries by a country mile. So no trade is definitely not the answer. We need the right kind of trade, and Marie-Claire alluded to that. And there are innovative legal provisions. So as a legal professional and teacher of law, I'm always sort of drawn back to the legal text. And of course, we have, for example, provisions that make compliance with the Paris Agreement an essential element. So going forward, maybe that's something the region might want to consider. There are proposals to make biodiversity in compliance with the global biodiversity framework also an essential element, because those two elements are key also in the Sustainable Development Goals. I think it's extremely important to find the right language. And we have multiple examples of what can be agreed in this particular policy space. We have even collected examples, especially in the EU-Latin America relationship, with our community of experts and community of practice, to look at discussions in the coordination councils, discussions in the trade and sustainable development committees, to see what can be done if you don't want to reopen the treaty text itself. And we found that so many of the sustainable development goals and individual targets could be at least advanced if the trading partners actually discussed those, the achievement of the SDGs with each other. There are fantastic examples of discussion, for example, between the EU and Central America, or between the EU and Chile. And all those examples we have summarized, and they might provide an a really interesting lesson going forward. I think what your paper has shown and what the interventions today have shown is that only if trade helps to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals and is inclusive, will there be a future of trade? And I think that's an important take-home message. Thank you very much.
That was brilliant as well, within time, but also very punchy with practical ways forward, Marcus. We actually, together with the 5 Cs, which is the Caribbean Climate Change Center, are organizing a workshop between the trade and the climate communities to start looking at ways that trade instruments can advance the SDGs as CARICOM member states begin to prepare for submitting their nationally determined contributions. But I also like the positive spin that both you and Marie-Claire as academics are bringing to how we make it an opportunity and use the trade frameworks as that sort of centering piece. Because I think people think about trade as so technical, so state of the art, but so removed from achieving these goals. But as you look at using trade to embed the investment opportunities and to kind of create the framework for a different type of conversation, exactly as Canada has done, and we are featuring Canada in our paper. I wanted to say that to the ambassador. But just looking at best practices, again, these are huge countries with many more resources, but if we can still draw, New Zealand has done an amazing amount of work. And from a very small country in Latin America, as you're saying, with the European Union, maybe the opportunities in these countries, the economies of scale, are very different from the Caribbean, but we can still draw innovative approaches that are more future-looking than I think we have done in the past. So on that note, I know, Minister, you're here. You heard these experts. We should bring them down, shouldn't we, to discuss more, along with Ambassador, to discuss some of these approaches as you're developing the Barbados and CARICOM policy, because there's a wealth of information here. I just want to go quickly to the questions, and we have some great ones. I think Peter Gay answered the first one, which was asking about the impact assessments, and they're done in different agreements. And as Peter Gay mentioned, there's one that was the only one so far that was done for CARIFORUM. So this trade agreement between the European Union and the CARIFORUM, which is the CARICOM and the Dominican Republic, there was an impact assessment that was done and commissioned, which gave some insights into how the trade was actually being conducted between these two regions. But it's more generally different agreements have different provisions for IAs. I see two questions. I'm going to just throw it out to my panelists in the remaining 4 minutes to take whichever one they would like. From Griselle. Is there an interest in exploring the need for entrepreneurial ecosystem building at the intersection of inclusive trade? And how can very specific hydroaeroponic innovation called the Gaia box, which helps counter food security while also generating renewable energy. How can we introduce that into this conversation? Anyone who wants to enter into these specifics is free to. Marie-Claire, you said you loved that first one. Go ahead, Marcus and Marie-Claire, and Minister, if you have to. Do you have to leave, Minister?
I do, but if you wanted me to take a stab at it, first of all, I would agree that we do have to build up that entrepreneurial ecosystem. And in my judgment, it goes right back to the very start of the conversation. Diversification in small island states like ours is imperative. We have to identify niche markets. I am not sure that those that we just alluded to would be the be-all and end-all of the effort, but we do have to identify those areas which are, as I said, niche and establish competitive advantages for some of these small states. It then allows us to do more in terms of attracting the level of investment. I think depending on what it is that you are deciding to settle on, you can then build out an infrastructure, whether it is logistical, transport, communications. I believe that digitization of these economies is an imperative as well, because it is really the great enabler and it closes much of the divisions that exist between small states and the larger ones to the North Atlantic. So yes, I'm all in on the suggestion of the ecosystem entrepreneurially being part of the intersection of trade.
Excellent. And I think we need to give trade a better face and name. And I think you're the minister to do it, Minister. Mary Claire and then Marcus. The other
Yeah, I
two
mean,
questions.
I would agree as well. I think it's a great question. And in a way, this idea of the entrepreneurial ecosystem building is something that we could be directly and clearly mentioning in the provisions of our trade agreements, but also as your study recommends, Jean-Yves, you are saying that you can see places where the institutions behind those treaty texts can make a difference in pushing the dial on this. And I think that's actually quite crucial. And I think you're right. We need ministers like our colleague who's joined us today, who are able to understand and move forward that agenda. In terms of this one about the Gaia, I'm going to put it back to Petegay and the others from the Caribbean, because it sounds like a lovely project, and I do know others that are doing sustainable aviation fuel while also doing renewable energy in order to put them together. So it really does sound absolutely brilliant. My one last point is that I did see the question earlier on impact assessments, and of course we drew on the impact assessment that you provided in your answer for the Athena's treaty study. It was this that helped us to identify what some of the tensions were, and then to start looking for good practices of actual treaty provisions that respond to those tensions and mitigate them, right? Because I mean, you don't just do an impact assessment so that you could complain about the trade agreement. You do it so you can include provisions addressing those potential impacts and forestalling them. Like, that's the idea. And I would just underline that we can find these impact assessments in many, many, many websites across the world. They're published by the organizations that do them, including the European Union. And it really is worth taking a quick look because they need that kind of public input. Stop there.
Excellent. And some of these there's some that invite conversations before the agreements are put in place. So, as they're thinking of new trade instruments, it may not be an impact assessment, but it may be a consultation from relevant stakeholders. And by the way, we have had some of these on CBAM in Trinidad and Tobago. Highly recommend a study on the potential impacts of the carbon border adjustment mechanism that University of the West Indies Trinidad did with the ISD. But you can also have it on a regular basis arising out of trade agreements after they have come into play. So really, really great place for us to look, Petegay, for areas where there are tensions and where we can use the agreements, as you say, to overcome. We're done in like half a minute, but let me give Marcus and Petegay half a second just to conclude, and then we'll wrap it up.
Half a second, just to say, of course, we need to rely on entrepreneurs. We need to create the right environment for them to be able to do their innovative work. And just to highlight that so many trade agreements, as you've also documented in your study, contain provisions on future food security, on security of food, on innovative agriculture like hydroponics. And so searching for those provisions and finding the markets where that kind of produce or that kind of mechanism can be successful is also part of the trade puzzle. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Peter, you can bring it to a close.
Right. Well, I first of all want to say thank you to the presenters and for persons who have joined on the chat today. But one thing that I wanted to underscore, and I think Jen and I were talking about it yesterday, was just the importance of genuine civil society engagement to ensure that the process is inclusive. I know for the Caribbean region that there is a little aversion to greater inclusion of civil society in the governmental process. So I think that this agenda will hinge quite a bit on that in terms of greater inclusion of the civil society groups and also ensuring that they are properly funded to be able to go on the ground and get the necessary data and intervention from other stakeholders to inform the trade policy process.
Thank you so very much, Peter. Great, great way of ending. Let me thank my panelists, those who had to leave and those who have stayed the course, Marie Claire and Marcus, as well as Ambassador Theodore, as well as the minister, Professor Cordonnier, Dr. Gehring. It was a brilliant conversation, just the start, I hope. And let me thank also our IT person, Sam, and Adila, for helping us with all the logistics and the background for making this possible. And all of you who stayed the course, look out for our SRC policy brief. It'll be shortly after we've taken into account some of these wonderful interventions. It will shortly be released, and we hope we can engage in even greater stakeholder engagement on some of the findings. So thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you on another panel, another SRC lunchtime chat. Enjoy your weekend. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.